Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar, Addressing Justice System Inequities Head-On. We'll get started in a few minutes to allow for additional sign-ins past the hour. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Stepping Up webinar today, Addressing Justice System Inequities Head-On. My name is Mark Stovall, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. To give you an overview of the webinar today, we'll start with some introductions. Then I'll turn things over to Thomas Eberly from the Justice Management Institute. He'll be moderating a virtual panel discussion today on identifying and addressing inequities in your criminal justice systems and how to facilitate often difficult conversations on those inequities. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for questions and answers from all of you who are listening in today. And turning to some introductions, we're excited to have three panelists and our moderator with us today as we try out a virtual panel discussion. Our moderator is Thomas Eberly, Program Director at the Justice Management Institute, or JMI. At JMI, Tom serves as site coordinator for the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge. He also helps to oversee the National Network of Criminal Justice Coordinating Councils. Prior to JMI, Tom served as a criminal justice director in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, where he created and managed Mecklenburg County Criminal Justice Services. Before moving to North Carolina, Tom was the deputy director at the Institute for Law and Policy Planning in Berkeley, California, where he analyzed and provided recommendations to criminal justice systems across the country. In addition, he served as criminal justice coordinator for Summit and Lake counties in Ohio. Our first panelist joining us today is Christy Danford, project director at the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee in Charleston, South Carolina, where she has served since the committee's inception in 2015. Previously, she served as a probation and parole agent in South Carolina, a court administrator in Connecticut, and as a senior associate with the Crime and Justice Institute. She holds a Master of Public Administration with a concentration in Urban Affairs from the College of Charleston and a Bachelor of Science degree from Charleston Southern University. Next up, we have Michael Daniels, Director of Justice Policy and Programs at the Franklin County, Ohio Board of Commissioners. Michael joined the staff of Franklin County Commissioner Marilyn Brown in March of 2012, and in June of 2017 transferred to the county's Justice Policy and Programs, where he is the point person for Franklin County's Stepping Up initiative and the Data-Driven Justice Initiative. Prior to joining Franklin County, Michael was co-owner and co-publisher of Outlook Media, Ohio's progressive and GLBT media company, and a frequent commentator in print and on radio and television. Michael holds a master's degree in chemistry from Washington University in St. Louis and a bachelor's degree in chemistry and Spanish from Franklin College of Indiana. And we also have Tiffany Iannacco, Justice Services Director in Buncombe County, North Carolina, to complete our panel today. Tiffany leads Buncombe County's strategic efforts in the area of criminal justice reform. In addition to system-level coordination, she oversees criminal justice programs and services, such as pretrial services, the Justice Resource Center, Family Justice Center, and MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge Grant. Notable work includes improving racial equity and community engagement through the reform efforts to including expanding access to diversion programs. Tiffany has previously worked in both crisis, inpatient, and outpatient settings, providing clinical behavioral health services and supervision in Asheville and Greensboro, North Carolina. Tiffany holds a master's in public affairs from Western Carolina University, as well as a master's in mental health rehabilitation counseling and bachelor's in criminal justice and psychology from North Carolina A&T State University. And thank you all for joining us today. For a little bit of background on Stepping Up is a national partnership between the American Psychiatric Association Foundation, the Council of State Governments Justice Center, and the National Association of Counties. We celebrated our 5th year this past May in supporting counties to step up to address the criminalization of approximately 2 million individuals with serious mental illness annually. We're proud of our now 521 counties covering 43 states and 47% of the U.S. population. To learn more and to find helpful resources like our Project Coordinator Guide, Self-Assessment Tool, or Strategy Lab, visit stepuptogether.org. And I want to talk a little bit about a technical assistance opportunity coming up soon. The Council of State Governments Justice Center is setting up a technical assistance, or TA center, under the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program. This center will offer training, resources, and TA to jurisdictions looking to improve their approaches for people with behavioral health in their criminal justice system, behavioral health needs in their criminal justice system. The format of TA could include individual consultations with CSG Justice Center staff, connections with subject matter experts and peers, virtual events and meetings, or curated online resources. State, local, and federally recognized tribal governments are eligible to apply and will be able to request TA through a request form on the website. And we're planning to launch this TA Center in the early fall, so stay tuned for updates. And before I move on, a few housekeeping items about the webinar. So during the webinar, you can ask a question at any time by tapping it into the QA panel on the bottom right-hand portion of your screen. And we'll respond to the technical related questions as we go, and we'll keep a running list of the content related questions and hold them till the end. And this webinar is also being recorded, and a recording along with a PDF of the slide deck will be available on the Justice Center's website and the Stepping Up website by next week. And now we'll turn things over to Thomas, who will talk about the Justice Management Institute.
Thanks, Mark. The Justice Management Institute is excited to partner with CSG on this webinar for the Stepping Up community and jurisdictions across the country. JMI is a nonprofit agency based out of Arlington, Virginia. Our organization conducts research and provides technical assistance for local criminal justice systems, and we've been doing this for well over 25 years. We specialize in helping counties and cities operate efficient and cost-effective courts, jails, and justice-related services. One of JMI's most important endeavors is overseeing the National Network of Criminal Justice Coordinating Councils. This network brings together 30 jurisdictions that are high-functioning criminal justice coordinating councils from across the country. The network allows these jurisdictions to exchange information on common issues that they're facing. The NNCJCC is fortunate to have outstanding members, 3 of whom are panelists for today's webinar. Each panelist is the director of their Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, although each council may have a different name in their particular jurisdiction. I'd like to just take a brief moment and ask the panelists to briefly describe their coordinating council and the function that it serves in their criminal justice system. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I don't know that, but I do have a skill you might like. It's called pleasing facts. Want to try it?
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Tiffany Hannah-Cho. I'll quickly describe Buncombe County's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. Ours is known as Buncombe County's Justice Resource Advisory Council. You can see the website listed there. It lists all of our stakeholders, including representation from the city and city manager's office and county manager's office. We have representation from our district and superior courts, our district attorney, public defender, defense bar representation, health and human service, juvenile justice, and a wealth of other criminal justice stakeholders, as well as recently in our adoption of our bylaws, have community representation serving on this council. It is one of our boards and commissions up under the county, and so we follow our bylaws, and some of the key initiatives that we've worked on include the establishment of our Justice Resource Center, applying for and implementing the MacArthur Foundation Stepping Up, Safety and Justice Challenge. So many initiatives, going on, but our Safety and Justice Challenge with the goal of reducing our jail population. So working collaboratively in some of those efforts, including the Stepping Up initiative and ensuring that we have mental health and substance abuse resources to divert people out of our jails and into treatment.
And hi, Charleston County's Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, you have the website there. It is a collaborative of local justice system leaders, behavioral health leaders, law enforcement officials, court leaders, victim advocates, legal advocates, and about a dozen community representatives. We formed in 2015, and we've been sort of able to start with a comprehensive assessment of our system initially, and then kind of went back over that entire assessment with a racial lens to really identify and enact the strategies that we've been working on with the help of the Safety and Justice Challenge. And then more recently, the group worked to better engage the community and sort of a broad scale effort to try to get more and more of the community engaged in elevating awareness and shaping the direction of what the council will focus on in the next 3 years. And all that information is readily available on our website, along with a whole mess of data in case you like data.
And it's nice to go last in these, Tom, because the ladies have already said everything I need to say. Our coordinating council looks a lot like theirs. It does serve as the policy board to bring people together and provide, if not a safe space, then certainly a brave space for people to hash out their differences and to vet ideas before they go out into the wider public. I think there's a very strong sense of camaraderie on there. There's a very strong sense that within those meetings, people are free to share ideas and have difficult conversations. And I would also add that with our, we call it our Criminal Justice Planning Board, but within our organization, we also have seats dedicated on that council for people with lived experience, as well as we have a seat on that council for the local police union, the FOP. We found that when we just had the chief of police or the sheriff on there, that decisions might get made at the brass level, but they didn't get down to the street. And we wanted to have representation from the rank and file as well. So we offered them that seat, and they've been tremendously productive and helpful members on that commission. So, but we look a lot like everybody else's, and our membership, bylaws, strategic plan, et cetera, can all be found on the website on the screen.
Great. So now, before we get started, we want to do 2 quick polling questions to get a sense of where everyone is located and where your jurisdictions are at in terms of addressing inequities. And so you should see shortly 2 polling questions pop up on the right-hand portion of your screen. And we'll give about 2 minutes to submit your answers. And so the first question is, in which region of the country is your jurisdiction? And the second question is, where does your jurisdiction currently stand in discussing inequities? So go ahead and take about 2 minutes to fill out those questions, and then we'll display the results. And if you're just joining, or if you've been on and haven't filled out the questions yet, we're going to close the poll soon. So just take a minute to answer each of these two questions here. And then we're just taking a second to compile the results. Great. So for the answer to the first question about where you're located, we have about 10% in the Northeast, 28% in the Midwest, 15% in the Southeast, 5% Southwest, and 12% in the West. And then for the second question about where does your jurisdiction currently stand in addressing disparities or inequities, 8% of you said inequities are a low priority, 23% said inequities are somewhat a priority, 27% said they're a high priority, and then 10% aren't sure. So thank you all for answering those polling questions. That's helpful to get a sense of where you're located and where your jurisdictions are currently at in terms of their efforts to identify and to address inequities.
So the polling results are very interesting. It's nice to see that at least half of those that responded are starting to seriously look at inequities in the criminal justice system and the behavioral health systems. And I'm really curious as we get to the question and answer session to hear some of the experiences that you're facing. And hopefully our panel can help answer some of those questions for you and maybe provide some ideas. I just got to say that, I know it's a struggle to engage in these types of conversations, and I hope today's webinar is useful and you can hear what other jurisdictions are doing to address this topic. So let's jump in and talk about how to address system inequities. We have broken our discussion today into 3 different sections for our panelists. The first section covers how to approach disparities in the justice and public health systems. The second is how to facilitate difficult conversations as an agent of change. And then lastly, we're going to ask the panelists to talk about how to develop strategies and implement change. Next slide, please. I personally have worked in the criminal justice system for 30 years, and for most of my career, people did not want to talk about inequities in the justice system and the behavioral health systems. The inequities always seem rather obvious, especially if you've ever walked through a jail or spent time in a criminal courthouse. Now, there's a tremendous amount of data to demonstrate the existence of these inequities, and this data is fairly well known as it gets published. Still, there seems to be this general uncomfortableness and even defensiveness when talking about disproportionality, overrepresentation, or a lack of fairness. This is especially true if the discussion on inequities are related to race and ethnicity. For many, it's just a very difficult conversation to engage in. Fortunately, this does seem to be changing. Each of the panelists today comes from a jurisdiction that is tackling inequities head-on. And as the directors of their criminal justice coordinating councils, much of this effort is being led by them. So let's start off with a question for Michael. As a leader in your justice system, what is your personal approach for taking on disparities in the criminal justice and behavioral health systems?
So I think, Tom, we we started by setting a set of ground rules that we were not going to talk about specific individuals or even specific groups of people. We were going to talk about actions that happen and results that come from those actions. And so we don't use language like the police are all biased, for instance, because people start to shut down, or the prosecutor's office is racist. We don't start with that, but we can use the data to show us that there are disparities in terms of who gets stopped and who gets charged and for what and so forth. The other thing that we laid out pretty early on was we got buy-in that the system itself is broken. And so we were able to start from the beginning and say, it is possible for good people with the best of intentions to make terrible racist decisions if they are doing so by using a system that is designed to be racist, or that it has built-in racism. And so it sort of takes the individual out of it and says, what are the policies, what are the decision points, what are the formula that we are using? Not necessarily trying to get into what is in someone's heart or what is in someone's mind. And we let the data take us where it takes us. The data don't lie. And so the only thing I can say beyond that is if you are a member of this group and you become a little uncomfortable or a little squiggly in your seat because the data are showing something you don't like, that's a great opportunity to say, I don't like that, let's fix it, rather than to just be beat up because it's there and then nothing ever gets done to really solve it. But I think you have to go in with an understanding of, we are going to talk about the facts, we are going to agree to do our best to be comfortable having very uncomfortable conversations. And we are going to all have the same vision at the end of the day, and that is that we want every single person to be treated with equity across the justice system, and we know that that's not happening currently.
And so, Michael, what was your personal journey as you took on this challenge? I mean, you're a white male working in a county with a fairly large African American population. How did you orient yourself in your own mind to say, I'm going to take this on and be a champion?
It's an interesting question. It goes back a little bit. I started with the county in 2012, as you read, and I've moved down here in 2017. But from the years of about 1999 to about 2003, 2004, I personally had a pretty severe methamphetamine habit. And so I'm celebrating 17 years of sobriety this November. But in the process of looking back at that, I realized that the only reason that I was not incarcerated, and the only reason probably that I'm still not incarcerated, is that I was a middle-class white dude driving a Subaru. And I mean, I would end up in neighborhoods where I shouldn't be, with things in the glove box that I shouldn't have, and the police would stop and they'd say, excuse me, sir, but you appear to be lost, and this neighborhood probably isn't safe for you, and they would help to escort me out of the neighborhood. If I had been the same age, black, driving a Buick, I would still be incarcerated. And so, Tom, I come at it from a very personal place of recognizing that some combination of dumb luck and white privilege has kept me out of the system and has allowed me to see it from that perspective. And I feel like I have an obligation to myself and to the community to tell that story and to intervene and to give back. Coming from, I cannot deny my white privilege, but I can use it, hopefully for good, not for evil. And so being able to at least be at the table and being able to tell stories and get people's attention. But it comes from a very, very personal place for me.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. Christy, in South Carolina, you're doing wonderful things working with your groups. What was your personal approach as you set out on this journey to address inequities in the behavioral health and the criminal justice system? What inspired you to get involved?
I think, first and foremost, that this kind of work and working on justice reform is kind of my life calling. I've been blessed to, never have to look at a clock and wonder when the day is going to be done. And that certainly comes from a long history of experiences, as a child growing up around and realizing very easily that I could have just as easily lost my dad, as many other kids do, for the criminal justice system. And as we kind of look at this in Charleston, we formed in 2015. We're in the Deep South. We're in the area where enslaved Africans, first set foot on this continent. There's a lot of history here, and there's a lot of collaboration in the community in general. So part of it was getting the buy-in of our system leaders to want to look at this issue and open their doors and open their data, and not just, themselves, but also, when we did it initially, I will say, I think one of the smart moves we made was we first looked at the system to kind of have that uniting value around we want to improve our system. And then we looked over it again, with the racial lens, and we had a lot of very small meetings where each individual stakeholder was digesting their own data personally, and that included doing it with community representatives. So by the time, we kind of brought everybody together to kind of throw the numbers up on the very large screen, the undeniable challenges that needed to be tackled, that they had already kind of gone through that initial shock and awe moment, and I think that helped to kind of forge better dialogue that was less defensive and more action-oriented. So that's kind of where we've started, and then we've, sort of taken it as an evolution to do a lot of education and awareness raising, and bring in, the voices that matter most, the folks most directly impacted, to really guide the conversation and know, this kind of stuff is not going to get handled in, an ivory tower. It's going to be handled on the streets, in the neighborhoods, out in the community. So really kind of pulling in as much of the community as we can and setting, lifting up, what may be the obvious, but really, giving it credibility and credence and pointing it in the direction of, this is what matters to our justice system, and these are the things that we need to keep working on because they're not right and they need addressing.
So in Charleston, you've just done a wonderful job using data to capture, the disparities, the inequities, the overrepresentation, and you've been doing it for quite a while. What was your rationale in really latching onto the data and producing these wonderful reports that are available online and that shape your strategic plans?
Well, without data, we don't know, right? We're stuck with anecdotes and gut instincts, and the data really, they are the grounding force, for looking at the information objectively. And as Michael said, the data don't lie. And when we do that, I also think, in all of the reforms that we're working on and we've been working on, the better educated and the more accountable our justice system is to the community that we serve, no better way to measure that than actually measure that. So making that data available, making it transparent, and being held accountable to achieve strategic initiative, goals, that's what we're here to do, right? We're here to serve and better serve our community, and without the data, we don't know how well we're doing.
And you also conducted surveys. What was that? What was the strategy behind that?
So in 2019, we had known, we were kind of 3 or so years into doing our work, and, inevitably, disparity, recidivism, and pretrial justice were really big issues that we know we can't tackle alone in a state that's sort of fraught with structural barriers and policy barriers. But to sort of build that coalition and grow that support and to raise awareness about those issues, we embarked on I remember in the beginning thinking it was a little crazy about what we were trying to do, but we figured why not? Let's try to engage over 1,000 members of our community in helping to shape the next strategic plan. So that involved both in-person large events where we can kind of showcase and bring in a lot of different community collaborators and community members to have, sort of small conversations and big conversations on these issues, deeper dive roundtable dialogues where folks got to know each other and dive a little bit more intimately into these topics with one another and get to know their neighbor. But those are events that require people to show up and come out. And obviously, not everybody can show up and come out, nor, whether they want to, they may not be able to. The surveys were sort of the way to try to reach farther and wider than we could in an event. So that was a short, sweet, very brief community survey that we put flyers in every location we could think of. We were on the news, in the media, word of mouth, radio, whatever way we could get it out there to try to get as many folks to respond as we could. So we had sort of the qualitative feedback as well as the quantitative feedback to guide those conversations.
Yeah, great. It's really impressive. I encourage everyone to go to your website and see what you've produced. And Tiffany, I mean, you've also produced some just fantastic data at the different decision points and used that to kind of demand that a conversation be had. What in the data surprised you, and what kind of response did you get from some of the decisions, or the data, I should say, at the different decision points from the different stakeholders? What kind of response did that generate?
I don't think we had any surprises, because I think where we started at was at least trying to get a shared analysis of what is racism, what is inequity, what does it really mean. We were trying to get out of the language of individual acts of racism, but more of the structural and institutional definitions. And so setting some foundation, we knew or expected to see disparities across every decision point. I think for us, as we started to drill deeper, it just led to more questions and more avenues of figuring out where the disparities are, and it gets very nuanced and caveat. So for us, we realized quickly you can go down a rabbit hole because every question leads to a disparity, which leads to another question of disparity. And I give you 3 decision points that we were looking at for us that led to some more questions was around our length of stay. That's kind of where we started for Black defendants. And then we compared between the lower level charges and the higher level charges. It was really length of stays and higher level charges. Then we started exploring a little more, and it was really length of stays with probation violations and new high level felonies and violent felonies. And so started to do what we called a case review, looking at some 15 cases that got disposed of where the outcome was the same. Everybody of those small populations were convicted and went to prison. And so really trying to dig deeper and understand, well, if the risk assessment had kind of the same, because there's these anecdotal stories, right? Black defendants' risk assessments might be more, their bond is higher, or they're more likely to have a public defender. And so people are asking these questions, and we're trying to really uncover the nuance in it. And sometimes it's just not true. It's just, we notice at every decision point, there's something going on that leads to the disparate outcome. And some of it is systemic or system issues, and some of it is the conditions in which people are living in because of the systemic issues and racism. And so really trying to tease that out and think through innovative ways. And I think we'll talk about that, collectively of how we've taken those strategies to see it. So really digging deeper and looking at, understanding that no one is a contributor to what we're seeing in the system.
So did you find anyone that just jumped up and said, hey, I'm uncomfortable with this. I don't want to talk about this. This makes my agency look bad. I'm an elected official. It makes me look bad. And maybe any one of the 3 of you could answer that question, but what kind of resistance did you give to the data itself?
The resistance we more saw was around, we did see resistance, and I don't want to call it resistance, but I call it lack of willingness to engage and want to learn further, and more of just not wanting to participate in the process, not showing up to meetings or having the discussion. And discussion usually is because when we have discussions on racism, it's not our system. Our systems are fair and just, it's the conditions that people live in. It's the economic status. It has nothing to do with race. And so one thing we would, Groundwater Racial Equity Institute, it shows you is when you look at disparities across social economic factors remaining constant. So you're comparing white, Black, Latinx, other races by their economic status, so how much they're making or their educational level. Blacks still end up with worse outcomes. So regardless, we are trying to really show the case that it's really rooted in race, but you have to be present to learn that information. So that goes back to the willingness to be able to participate and show up and have these honest discussions and wanting to learn more. And so, I think we have some champions in this process. I necessarily didn't have to come into space leading it. When I first got to the county and meeting with different stakeholders, they all recognized, hey, racism is a problem. We had a work group. They needed support and help organizing and moving the project. And so that's where I came in to help lead it, help support the stakeholders, whether it was a judge or the public defender, and moving the work forward and moving it along. And so something that Michael, highlighted is important for us to work together and support each other. And so there's this term like of white allyship, and what does that mean, and being able to speak on that. And Michael kind of hinted to what that meant. And so I'm just curious, what his thoughts are and what Christy's thoughts are and what that looks like in their communities, and how does allyship work?
I think it's critically important, Tiffany, because I think racism is a white problem. I don't think racism is a white problem that causes trouble for Black people. But it's not a problem that Black people need to fix. It's a problem that white people need to fix. And so I think that strong white allyship is really important when it comes to this, and being able to step up and say what we have historically done has caused damage and trauma, and we are therefore responsible for fixing it moving forward. And so I think it's really important that we stand up. I come at this from, I look and I say, I look on and say, women didn't get the right to vote because they gave it to themselves, right? They had to convince men to come along with them. And I didn't get the right to get married because 7 gay people on the Supreme Court gave that to me. I got that right because I had to bring a lot of straight people along with me, right? And so it's now my turn, and we've got to come along and realize that this is an allyship that we have to lead. And so that's, for me, that's why it's critically important.
And so if I could just jump in real quick. Both your counties just recently declared a public health crisis, that racism is actually a public health crisis, and both your CJCCs issued their own declarations in Buncombe and Franklin counties. What does this mean, and why was this such an important action to be taken?
So I would say in Buncombe, like you mentioned, our CJCC, as well as our Health and Human Service Board, were looking at data, and it finally came to a point of like, we have to acknowledge that something is occurring and that there is a crisis. And so, you have 2 boards within our organization looking at and trying to solve for racism and recognizing this is something that we learned early on. We cannot do racism in the criminal justice system or the disparities in the criminal justice system by ourselves, because this is so structural in the way that racism was designed, how our institutions work together to keep perpetuating the cycle. And so African Americans have had 60 years of alleged equal access to this country, equal access to the rights that were provided in our Constitution. And so that's 300 and something years of trying to undo something. And although that laws now are created race neutral, our systems are still in place. And so what we see that in the data as well as narrated experience. To Michael's point, African Americans and any people of color, any oppressed group, have vocalized and told stories. And so when you start looking at that as a collective and looking at data as a collective, and you realize that our conditions in which we see people living in, Michael's point about trauma, the trauma of racism and how it plays a part. So how that relates to our laws, such as the war on drugs or redlining or educational systems, how we fund land and home ownership opportunities, and then we see these outcomes and we see violence in our community. I believe we're highlighting like the need. We have about 8 African American males that was murdered in Buncombe County this year, and that is very much out of disproportionate and does not even reflect what we see across our state. And so what does declaring racism mean as a public safety and public health issue is it elevates this as an emergency, as a crisis, just like the opioid crisis, just like COVID. And so that gives the county staff the ability to prioritize this, or direct staff to prioritize this issue. It elevates it to the point where our partners and our communities can be involved in the solutions. And it also commits resources, whether it's resources for personnel or financial, but whatever we need to do to eradicate this or eliminate racism in our society, this declaration helps start that, especially on a local level. However, sometimes a lot of these crisis work should be elevated out of our federal and our national level to help support local jurisdictions in doing the work too.
And Michael, do you have a follow-up to that?
I do. I think Tiffany's hit this directly on the head as to why this is important. It focuses people's attention on it. And the other thing that I think looking at it as a public health crisis does is lets us frame conversations in a way that maybe people can understand better. For instance, we're all wearing masks and staying 6 feet apart and doing Zoom conferences, right? That's not a COVID neutral solution. That is an anti-COVID solution. We all get vaccines in the fall. That is not a flu neutral solution. That is an anti-flu solution. And I think that once we can start talking about racism as a health crisis, it helps us get past this concept that if we just create racism neutral programming, everything will be fine from here on out. It's nope, you have to really attack this in an anti-racism kind of way. And that's a conscious and targeted decision, not just we're going to throw up our hands and say everybody's equal and we're going to do our best. And so I think that helps us to focus that, to look at it in the same way that we would look at any other health crisis, and almost look at it through an epidemiology kind of lens, and be able then to target treatments for racism, as opposed to just talk about it as though it's this abstract concept that you can never really get your hands around.
Well, I guess salute both your jurisdictions for taking this step. It was just a wonderful thing to read and to see that other jurisdictions across the country are following. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So when you talk about addressing racial and ethnic disparities in the justice and behavioral health systems, it's a really big job. I'm telling you something you already know. You need partners and support. And Christy, I really want to ask you this: how do you go about identifying champions and allies for taking on inequities in your system?
I think that the single biggest thing is to go alone. There are people that have been working, and like particularly here in Charleston, on some of these issues, for their whole life, right? And going downtown and knocking on the door at the NAACP chapter headquarters and getting stopped by the law enforcement officer within kind of a more of a vulnerable section of town, asking me why I was there. And I was like, I'm coming to meet with the president of the local NAACP. That was kind of an aha moment for me, going, okay, here we go. But that was just going to the people who know best, who've been doing it for a long time, and forging those relationships and bringing them closer to the table, whether it's our YWCA or, different areas where you kind of, it mushrooms. The more you know, the more you get into it, the more people you're going to find, and the bigger the coalition is going to grow. And I think that's been one of my sort of more fortunate things about it is sort of seeing the light bulbs go off, because now there's a platform. And I think a CJCC provides that unique platform in many respects to bring all these parties to the table. We're not just talking about, a law enforcement agency or a school in the community. Like, we're talking about the whole community, you know, and looking at it systemically and holistically. And I think that gets people, one, to the door, and then it keeps them coming back. And I like to see, you know, that kind of network and groundswell start to grow as you get more of those folks into the table. And I think the other point I would just make on that is it's going to be difficult. It's never going to be easy. But within that, making sure to make a space at the table for everybody, no matter where they view their point of view comes from, so that there's an opportunity for that constructive dialogue and you know, opening those doors up and hearing whatever, you know, perspective there may be. I do a lot of listening. And then, you know, again, bringing the conversation back to, okay, where can we unite? Where are there some commonalities? And let's talk about, you know, how we can advance this discussion in a more data-grounded way. And then recognize, and I think one of the delicate balances that we have as CJCC directors is not wanting to overwhelm people either. But there's a whole, once you get into this, you know, we did a massive report, not just on the disparity that we saw in our system, but also looked locally and nationally around housing, economics, you know, behavioral health, all sorts of different aspects where you see the disparity thread all the way through. And it's easy for people to get overwhelmed and say, well, that's more than I can do. And it's, you know, kind of, you know, you got to kind of walk that line to keep people engaged, keep them coming back, but also find the quick wins or opportunities to sort of build up momentum to keep doing more and not just get overwhelmed by the sheer, you know, largeness of it all.
And I'm really curious, as you guys went on this journey, did you find difficulty establishing trust in different communities because they feel like they've seen the song and dance before? What makes it different this time? Did you run into some resistance when it comes to reaching out to these folks because there's just a history of distrust of what are you going to do this time that's really going to make a difference?
First, I would say I'm sure there is more of that to be had. I mean, nothing's ever perfect. We have to keep working on that in every step of the way. But I will say one of the fighter moments was when we brought our community representatives in the first time together, and you know, it was just me and 8 or 9 community representatives, and I put the numbers up on the screen, and we talked, and I had a senior gentleman bend over and start crying. I had somebody else slam their hand on the table going, see, I knew it. Now everybody knows it, and they're pointing at it, and the data are there. And those same voices, as they got, more acclimated, and the group got more acclimated to working on this together, they're the ones that went out and told other people, this isn't just a meeting about a meeting. Like, this is a group that's actually looking to make change. And that building that credibility has helped us to this point, but I don't take it for granted, and I expect we're going to have to keep doing that in different circles every step of the way.
And Tiffany, I think your jurisdiction in particular has really done some innovative things in terms of social media, especially during COVID, to keep this going and to reach out to the community. Can you describe some of the strategies that you put forward to keep this dialogue going?
Sure. We were, kind of in our spaces of doing community engagement, is doing a lot of going out in the communities, doing listening sessions. And so when our courts had to change direction and make sure that we ensure that community was getting informed of the change process of when they needed to appear in court or when things may be continued, creating a space for a virtual session. We didn't think we would get the turnout that we did. We were able to have our stakeholders, so someone from the DA's office and the public defender's office, kind of explaining processes, opportunities to give community information about the changes. And we ended up being able to show it on Facebook Live. One thing I did not know, we used actually Zoom. You can do live interpretation. So we had Spanish translation occurring during the time of the Zoom meetings. And then we were also live streaming it on Facebook, and then able to post those recordings on our YouTube accounts and spread it through our county networks and our Facebook pages. And so To date, I think we had about 5,000 people who viewed the document or viewed the town hall. So 5,000 people in our community making sure that they had access to the information. We're also undertaking a way, and we talk about engaging community, duplicating that soon and doing it as we are up for our renewal, a grant application, wanting to get community's input on how do we effectively, or what do we need to effectively do as it relates to criminal justice reform. A lot of those spaces are providing access to behavioral health services. And so what does those services look like for community? And so holding a virtual listening session in the coming weeks to kind of really get community's input. And we're going to hopefully that is just as successful as our virtual town hall that happened in June.
And so, Michael, I was just following up on the comments that Tiffany made. I mean, in your jurisdiction, you brought together a group and they set a goal of reducing disparities by 50% over the next 5 years. What was some of the guiding principles that you feel are necessary for setting a goal like that and really making it something that is something that people can agree that we want, something that we value and work on?
Right. Well, I think one of the things that we tried to do early on in that process was to really define what our lane was going to be and what our lane was not going to be, and to focus on sort of in the serenity prayer sort of world. Let's focus on the things that we can change, and especially in light of George Floyd's murder and others, there was a whole parallel conversation going on that was specifically around police use of force and equipment and demilitarization and defunding. And we said, while that is a critically important conversation to have, it's not the one we're having as part of this bigger disparities across the justice system issue. And so we tried to separate that out, partly so that we could focus on policy and process changes we could make in the justice system across the board, and not just at the police department. And also really so we could get people to the table to have those conversations without, again, re-traumatizing a set of communities over and over and over. Every time you have to pull a group of people together and talk about the murder of that little boy or that little girl, you re-traumatize that neighborhood and that community. And why would they want to keep coming to the table if that's all you were ever going to do? So I think we really tried to set out what our lanes were going to be. And I think we had a group of folks who got together, and at that, when you show them the data, as Christy says, when you put it up on the slide, and you show early on, we did this a year and a half ago, for instance, that 28% of Franklin County, or 28% of the city of Columbus is Black. But Black men were 12 times more likely than white men to be arrested for minor marijuana busts. When you just put that kind of a number up on the screen, people do. They slap the table and they say, yeah, I know that happens. Our city council took action on that pretty quickly and decriminalized those small possession things. That was the win we needed to be able to go back and re-engage with other parts of the community who had been, as you say, yeah, I've heard this song and dance before. What's different about your committee? What's different about what we're doing is that not only are we putting data together, but we're making real policy recommendations and holding elected officials accountable for implementing those changes. And so a couple, three of those quick wins builds up a lot of trust. I think there were people who were voluntold to be at the first couple of meetings who are now very actively participating. And there was a certain amount of guilt. There was a certain amount of those one or two people who didn't want to be at the table. You called and said, you don't want to be the only one not there, right? All your colleagues are going to be. So you don't want to be the one running for election who didn't show up to this thing, right?
And so to me, it seems like each one of your jurisdictions went through some unfortunate event, some crisis. And I was curious if that crisis was a spark for change, or was it something that actually maybe set you back a little bit because it really exposed some harsh feelings and maybe some nerves that were too close to the surface? What was your experiences after those tragic events in your communities?
I think I was on mute. I think, Michael hit a nail on the head, like the trauma that occurs. It's hard to find the right space to have some of these conversations sometimes, because you, again, are re-traumatizing community. And then when you don't have a viable solution, right, or the solution isn't steeped in equitable practices, it can definitely create more harm. There was an incident that, occurred, I believe in 2017, where one of our law enforcement officers beat a pedestrian for jaywalking. And so that person really wanted to know why the harm was done to them. And so the space or the lens that we talk about is restorative justice. So whatever happened with that case and those outcomes, community wasn't aware or privy to what the healing that was needed for their victim. It sounded like another opportunity where a police officer got off on charges. And so if your community is not prepared to take the walk and repairing the harm, then it just happens to create more harm and more mistrust amongst systems. So that's why it's very important to have community at the table, to have people with lived experience at the table having these discussions in the front end, and to develop what programming looks like. What are equitable opportunities? What can we do to reduce trauma? A lot of it's happening in our community spaces right now in terms of building resiliency. And so a lot of community organizations are partnering to provide trauma-informed care, to do resiliency training, provide resiliency skills, kind of letting communities know what is the midbrain kind of reaction and how to reset and try to stay in resilient zones. And so it's very important, and we're looking at and doing it in a way that community leads it, where we can incorporate some of those practices into our own spaces. We have some programs that we're doing seeking safety, because a lot of our people that we see are in the justice system are affected by trauma. And so making sure that we are informed in our processes related to trauma, and hopefully can start healing and repairing some harm, so that way when these things do happen and occur, the community is prepared or has a better ability to navigate and process it.
Christy, for you, what was that event that really opened wounds and made it apparent that something had to be done?
Well, it's a cumulative series of events. I mean, we had the murder of Walter Scott just after our CJCC started. We also, had the tragedy at Mother Emanuel Church, and that I think was more of a broad. Both of those, brought community out, and they, brought them together in different ways. And then, just recently, with the protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, we've seen, some interesting, push and pull between the community and law enforcement. And I think kind of just thinking about them a little bit more broadly in our community, I think that the relationships that have formed and the conversations, and now it's just kind of interesting because when we're trying to engage the community, in the last year, we struggled to get young people to come out, right? I mean, you can look around some of our events, and we were missing the millennials, right? We were missing the younger kids. We tried to get them out, and it wasn't working. And now suddenly they're out in droves, protesting, and pushing their work. And I'm so excited they're out and that they're engaging, but kind of, we had just finished, this massive undertaking, and now we're thinking, what more can we do, and how can we, engage these kids in a way that's going to help, elevate the conversation. And also, one of the things we were learning after meeting with a couple of the protesters is they were asking for things that were already in place. So it kind of reiterated back to us, it's our job to do a better job of communicating and engaging, particularly if a protest has a demand that's asking for something that's already been in place. So, how do we better communicate going forward so that we can, keep working at it together? And a simple thing that we did, might sound trivial, but it was, we didn't have an Instagram account. So we formed an Instagram account, and suddenly, we've got more engagement than we did before with just Facebook and Twitter. I know it sounds silly, but we had one of our younger community representatives who's very active on social media to come in, and it's been cooking ever since. But there are little things, and, all of these tragic events, and I think the sustaining factor of the CJCC plays an important, part, because eventually protesters go home, but the work has to continue. And that's, really where, I'm excited more people are engaging, and that hopefully we can build more bridges and keep working at it, because it's a community issue, and it's got to be a community solution.
Yeah, very, very true. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So, we've talked about your personal approach and the value of cultivating strategic partnerships, especially with community members. The next action I really want to delve into with the three of you is, how do you turn all this talk into action? I look at the stuff that's going on in Franklin County. They just recently formed a Stepping Toward Justice committee, and they have a lot of ambitious things that they want to do. Michael, in Franklin, what are you doing to turn talk into action?
So we're trying to divide the elephant into bite-sized pieces first, and then focus on the ones that we can chew first. And so the data have been incredibly important here, right? And they continue to be important. But just today, I saw data come out of our city attorney's office, for instance, where they looked at traffic stops and pedestrian stops. So taillights, turn signals, jaywalking, that sort of thing. 70% of the arrests made for those things are Black folks, and that's a problem. And then what happens is when our Black residents are stopped and cited for those things, then warrants are run, or people say, why are you arresting me for this? Why are you stopping me? Why are you picking on me? And then things like resisting arrest charges get filed and so forth. So I think there will be a strong look at, can we convert those types of stops into simply mailing somebody a ticket? Is there a way? One of my suggestions is going to be, if you see someone with a burned out taillight, you could just take a photograph of their license plate and mail them a ticket the same way you would do if they ran a red light and the red light camera caught them. You don't have to stop them. And so there's just little things like that we're taking a look at. Where do the data lead us? Where are the charges? What part of the bond schedule? Who's staying in the jail and languishing too long? And then going back to each of those partners and pointing it out and saying, how can we work together to solve this? And when we've been able to just go through and pick off little pieces of it, I think the thing that we don't want to do is look at this as this is a big problem and we either solve it or we don't solve it, right? This is not we either cut down the tree or we leave the tree alone. We have to take this and start cutting branches off the tree and consider and realize that that's still progress. And so it's okay to take little bites at this, because we're going to reduce disparity here and then a disparity here and then a disparity here, because it's not just one, it's not just some sort of homogeneous problem. It's a whole bunch of little pieces. I like to say that every decision point in the system is biased against Black people, and the cumulative result is multiplicative. So the further you get down the system, the worse and worse and worse it gets. So let's try to figure out how to simply reduce the disparities at each of those touch points. And so those are the bite-sized pieces that we're going after. The other thing about that, Tom, is that because the planning board runs the gamut of the entire justice system, if we were just focusing on what happens at arrest, that would give some folks time to get bored, right? The judges might get bored, or the probation officers might get bored because we were just focusing on arrest. So the only people who are there at the table are maybe the sheriff and the police department, and maybe the city attorney. So if we do these across the board, we can keep everybody busy doing something, and not trying to, not focusing on one thing to the detriment of losing the interest and excitement of the remaining.
And Tiffany, I think it's really cool, following up on what Michael just said. One of the strategies I noticed that you guys are doing is that you're using racial equity tools to kind of build in reviews of policies and procedures, and making sure that there's not structural racism, institutional racism built into what you're doing. What's that process been like, and has it been very fruitful to this point?
Yes, I think when we looked at it, we approach it from what are some system changes we can make with some policies and procedural things we can make, and then what are some things that, like I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, like our community, our residents are impacted, and there's symptoms of a greater problem. But while we fix our policies and stuff, we have to make sure that we're also treating or helping support individuals affected by by racism. And so from a racial equity lens, some things we have to think about is like, who was at the table? Perfect example, because of COVID-19, we were assessing our behavioral health needs. We knew that there would be an uptick possibly in overdoses and suicides. So we were galvanizing our behavioral health communities together to really provide support and resources and think strategically. When we looked around the table, and I'm just a convener, I'm not a provider, I was the only Black person in these meetings and spaces. And so stopping and being intentional and say, okay, we need to make sure all of our communities are being represented when we have these discussions. We had felony drug diversion, and we had a lot of diversion programs, and they were for first-time, low-level nonviolent offenders. Well, if you look at the history, and the systemic racism, African Americans are more likely to be policed. They're more likely to have higher level charges. And so you already have these exclusionary practices. And so working and actually that's why the allyship is important. The leader of the diversion program and the coordinator went to the DA's office and was talking about some of the systemic issues that they're seeing and being able to provide evidence. So, we got our diversion program, the access expanded, and then we started looking, and someone said, I went to a treatment court best practice. And they said if a defendant doesn't have a violent offense previously or does, it does not dictate the outcomes of how well they'll do in these treatment courts. And so learning that information and being able to expand the criteria to include violent or people who have violent offenses or been convicted of violent offenses into our treatment courts. Looking at the use of citations, kind of like Michael was mentioning, the stop data. And then, recognizing too, even when we have people at the table, thinking about how people access services. We had a provider who provides services to African-American males say, I took 2 suicidal African-American males to the ED, and they were not, they were in crisis. Now, what does crisis look like for an African-American male versus, say, a middle-aged or older or white male? And so then being able to have the conversation with the emergency room and talk about what are some barriers and making sure that we are really being intentional in how we're serving our community. Because the way that depression might look like in African-American males and the symptomology may look a lot different from other people or other people of different races and even age groups. And so being sure that we're being culturally competent in the way we're assessing. Driver's license restoration is another idea of using that racial equity tool and thinking about fines and fees and who's impacted most by driver's license and having them revocated. And it's so amazing, like there are so many policies that have been put in place that it creates such a burden for people to be successful. So you're really unraveling this thread or these rubber band balls, because that's where the structural racism comes from. Then you have housing policies of men who may be convicted of a crime and then get banned from their community, and then they're trespassing and families get evicted. And so about that racial equity tool is making sure that we have all these stakeholders represented at the table. So when we're moving the rubber band from one area, someone else might be able to think about something they can do in their prospective agency. So lastly, like the example I can give is our CJCC is an advisory council, but every member has the power and should make their own decision for their agency. So as we have these discussions, the sheriff can go back in his office and say, hey, what does intentional recruitment of African Americans or people of color look like? Because, we cannot serve people that don't reflect the population. Our Superior Court judge started doing implicit bias training for grand jurors, or when grand jurors got convened. Our public defender started offering treatment courts for all defendants, regardless of race, to put some standardization in place. If they're eligible, we go ahead and offer it. It's not up to discretion of whether a public defender will offer it, but it's part of our process. And so we can have conversations and we can talk about what we can do as a system, but it also provides opportunity for people to think about what they can do in their respective agencies to lead change and create change.
And I'm so glad.
And I love what,
please, go ahead.
Tom, I was going to jump in just to piggyback on that. I love what Tiffany said about taking a look at those restrictions that we put on things, right? Because a lot of this is just healing the self-inflicted wounds that we've been shooting ourselves in the foot over and over and over on these things for years. We don't have to exclude people with a criminal record except for those who made meth in public housing from public housing. We don't have to have, that's not a federal requirement. Those are all put on by your local housing authority. We don't have to exclude people with violent convictions. We don't have to exclude people with any particular tier of sex offense from a variety of different programming, but we put them on there. I don't know, it's sometimes to make ourselves feel better, sometimes because we think we only have 10 slots, right? So we're going to narrow the pool of people, whatever the reasons might be. But I think what I try to do, and I annoy people to death here, is I end up being a little 2-year-old in the room when people say we're going to do this program, but we're not going to offer it to anybody with a violent crime. I say why? And you finally try to get to the root of what that really is, and usually it's because we've always done that.
The 5 whys, right?
And then I say, okay, and we've always done that, and see how well it's worked. And also take a look at, now apply that racial lens to that. And tell me what putting that restriction on, which you might not think is a proxy for race, but it is a proxy for race when you consider the 4 or 5 mitigating factors that take you from where you are to where you're going to go. And so anytime we put a restriction on, and this is, REI will tell you this when they come and do the training, anytime you try to put a system in place, you put restrictions in place, and you don't look at it through a racial equity lens, white people will rise to the top, black people will fall to the bottom, and other people of color will land in the middle someplace. So if you are not specifically asking those whys, and it better be a good funding reason or something else that you can't do those things, you're setting yourself up to perpetuate those racial inequities rather than to tear them down. So I would just ask everybody to, part of what we have to do is just stop shooting ourselves in the foot.
That's very good advice. We're unfortunately running out of time, but I just have to ask one more question. All 3 of you have emphasized training as part of your way to combat inequities in your system. Christy, for example, you've done a lot of training for different stakeholders throughout your criminal justice system. What's your motivation there? How effective has it been? And do you really see that as a change agent, so to speak, in improving the level of conversation?
In one aspect, it's helpful in terms of raising awareness and just understanding it a little bit better. But in terms of driving change, I would argue that you have to have a different set of skills in your tools in your toolbox. One of the things that we're looking forward to doing is building a race equity fellowship program here in our local community so that we can equip not just justice system leaders, but also partner them with folks that also work in the social service sector or business community in the tools and the skills that they need to lead change and to be agents of change when they go back into their respective organizations. You know, as Tiffany mentioned earlier, you know, different folks that run different shops in the justice system can do what they can do in their system, right? And maybe it's a policy decision. Maybe it's, you know, doing like what we did where we said, you know, we got our law enforcement agencies to agree to cite and release on 5 charges that they would agree on that we saw, you know, a disproportionate rate. And that works beautifully. We've found out cops love it. Community loves it. It works well, and it's lowered our relative rates. But it doesn't mean that those organizations are now anti-racist organizations, right? And to become that, you know, you have to really work at it. And I'm looking forward to kind of building those, you know, sort of softer skills and organizational change so that we really can start to take more deliberate approaches to how our organizations function and then how we collaborate as a community, you know, to really combat, you know, the disparities that we see all around us. I hope that answered your question.
Tom, I think the training is important from a standpoint of those who don't know history are destined to repeat it, right? And most of what we learn in history class has been whitewashed, mansplained, and straight edited to the point where it doesn't even look like reality. We are not taught all of those historical things that were done, specifically post 1865, to perpetuate slavery, to perpetuate the servitude of people of color. How many history books, I grew up in Central Indiana, how many history books in Central Indiana are going to talk about things like that? How many history books in Central Indiana are going to even mention redlining, right? You don't know what those things are for a while. And so until you can really get down and start to look at history and look at what has happened and why it happened and take off the facade of trying to protect the straight white patriarchy, until you can do that, you don't see what the reality of history in this country is, and until you see what the reality is, you can't hope to make change. At least that's my 2 cents worth.
Very good. Tiffany, just final thoughts on training?
I echo what I think Michael took the words out of my mouth, especially about the history and digging deep. I will say that you will see, I've seen, can't speak, but some cognitive dissonance. And so, like, the more you give or you try, because it's hard, especially as we talk about the criminal justice system and the idea of lady justice and the use of words of fair and just and equal. You're telling folks who've dedicated their lives to this criminal justice system, like, yeah, that's true on the outside, but that's not the way the system was designed. You know, people might fall back into or want to retreat and not want to lean deeper. And that could be, and that's some of the challenges, I think, and part of the obstacles we're facing is, like, how do we help people, I don't say relearn history, but be open to understanding the truths behind how this country was created, and also connecting the historical context to where we are today. Many people, slavery was so long ago, civil rights was so long ago. Well, how long ago was it actually? And what really is we're trying to understand is the legacy of slavery, the systems that were left behind because of slavery. If I break my leg and it heals, and it was a long time ago, that doesn't mean I'm not going to have some, or my ACL, difficulties with walking later on in life, right? Like, it might look good on the x-ray, but I might still experience pain. And so if we can look at it through that lens of, like, what are the ramifications, that might be a way of helping folks reframe these systems that were designed the way they were, and also acknowledging the curbside effect. Why are we helping African Americans and people of color? And I say people of color, Michael mentioned whites usually have the advantage where blacks are at the bottom and people of color are somewhere in the middle. But if you look at how we, or the purpose of the American Disabilities Act, right, with the curbside effect, it actually benefited not just someone who needed a wheelchair, but it benefited the jogger, the runner. It benefited businesses who had to move equipment from the truck into their stores. It benefited the mom using a stroller. And so, you know, we have to make sure that if we are not all successful, then we're not successful ourselves. And so I think, hopefully that's what the trainings are designed to do, and have these discussions of how we can help one another with our racial equity lens. Because, you know, we all don't have it. Just because I'm Black or a person of color doesn't necessarily mean I come into the spaces of knowing or how to be anti-racist. Because I was built and raised in the same country as many of us. So those are my closing thoughts on training.
And really, quite honestly, I wish we had more time, because I'd love to delve into the topic of reparations, which your county and city just passed, and we could easily spend 2 hours talking about that. And this would be a great panel to have that conversation with. But we are running out of time, and I do want to allow time for the attendees to pepper you with some questions. So I want to thank you personally for sharing personal information, sharing information about your jurisdictions, your challenges, and where you see areas of opportunity. It's very, very generous of you to share your time and your inner thoughts. So right now I'd like to turn it back over to Mark and see what kind of questions we have.
This afternoon. And we had a lot of questions come in from the attendees, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them, but I thought we could maybe cover 1 or 2 questions for the time remaining. One of the questions is, in what ways are you including impacted communities at the planning, implementation, and evaluation stages? And have you made the inclusion of these voices sustainable in your work? So possibly, like, if you've included those voices as part of your CJCC in these efforts.
One, for in Charleston, a lot of those voices are part of our CJCC. There are explicit seats held out for formerly incarcerated survivors of crime and a whole litany of folks. 2, I would say, you know, in the planning stage, the entire strategic plan that we just built and released is built on community groups coming out, you know, different conversations in all different pockets of the community. So a lot of that involvement went into identifying and setting community priorities. And then 3rd, I would say, in terms of implementation and evaluation, we have actual working groups working on each of the initiatives that are collaborative. So they're not just there's community members involved in pretty much every work group that we have. And when we don't get them in the work group, we always get them back in the CJCC in sort of a larger group level. So they're going to continue. It's not just a one and done deal. It will sustain.
Ours is similar. We have, through our grant, we've got funding to stipend or give stipends, because what we heard in kind of community perspective is you, A, always come to our communities, ask for information. There's never any follow-up. And B, we don't get paid for our time. And so if we're at work, we're having these meetings, we want to make sure our community partners have meetings. But the work has gotten so large in our community, people are wanting to volunteer their time, and people are wanting to come to the table despite that. So when it comes to sustainability, I'm definitely curious to see, you know, how committed, you know, we can make sure that community voices are always at the table beyond the life of our grant cycle.
And Michael, did you want to add to that?
I don't think there's anything that I could add on top of that. We have the Urban League, the LAPP, the local Latino group, and so forth at the table. They've always been at the table. They always will be.
Great. And then another question we have is, have any of the panelists used contracting for services as a way to advance race equity? So contracting with CBOs that are run by impacted people, for example, and how would you suggest counties approach this fiscal and programming aspect of equity?
So we have within, go ahead.
I would say we have, and one thing I've learning in spaces is we put so many contractual constraints on nonprofits, Black-owned businesses. Those aren't rooted in our structures. And then we do audits, and what I would like to see more of is walking people along the process and being more of a consultant. So they may have the expert knowledge in racial equity. We're the experts at contracting and operation of businesses, that we support communities in doing some of that work, or understanding or informing them of processes and expectations. And so that's a way that I think we sometimes can be more helpful as they're helping us. You know, we can also ensure that we sustain these organizations and be supportive of their needs as well.
I'd echo that, Tiffany. We every week when our commissioners approve purchasing requisitions for that week, the purchasing department reports out those contracts that have been given to women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a pretty expansive definition on that. We've included LGBTQ businesses as part of that as well. And so we track that. But within the department here, I've encouraged my team to reach out to non-traditional folks who have never gotten contracts before, because they're not the urban league size, right? They don't have somebody who monitors grants. So we have grant people internally, and at least once a quarter, our grant people talk to on the phone or go out and meet with all of our awardees before reporting is due, so that any questions can get lined out and it doesn't end up being punitive. Oh, you sent in the wrong stuff. It's, hey, let me reach out to you before these are due and make sure we're working together. And hopefully over the course of a year or so, teach you how this process works. And then we wean you off of that. But we're not going to say you can't come to the table because you didn't come with this vast array of knowledge about how to report for federal grants, because I don't know how to report for most of our federal grants, right? And the rules change. The rules change from day to day and secretary to secretary.
Great. Well, I know we're coming up on time, and there were a lot of questions that people asked that unfortunately we didn't get to, but the panelists would be happy to follow up by email after the webinar. And I wanted to extend a very big thank you to our panelists today for the great discussion, and for Tom, the moderator, for moderating this. And here you can see contact information for our panelists. And a reminder that we recorded this webinar today, and we'll have the recording and the slide deck available on the Justice Center website and the Stepping Up website by early next week. And thank you all again to the panelists, and thank you to the attendees for joining today.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon.